You don't procrastinate because you're lazy. You do it because you're seeing action through the wrong lens. This audiobook will flip that perception and collapse the gap between intention and action, starting right now. The Procrastination Trick. Audiobook. Introduction. You know the feeling. The weight of unfinished tasks pressing down on your shoulders, each postponed commitment adding another layer of invisible burden. The mental bargaining begins. I'll start as soon as I finish this one thing. Or, I'll be more focused if I wait until tomorrow. Yet tomorrow becomes today, and the cycle continues. Your mind races with justifications while anxiety builds in your chest, a constant reminder of what remains undone. This isn't just about missed deadlines or delayed projects. It's about the toll this pattern takes on your self-image, the growing gap between who you want to be and how you're actually spending your time. You've tried everything: productivity systems, time management techniques, accountability partners, yet find yourself falling back into the same patterns. Each attempted solution becomes another item on the growing list of strategies that worked for a while, but ultimately failed to create lasting change. But what if everything you believe about procrastination is wrong? What if the very way you've been trying to overcome it has been keeping you trapped in its cycle? Procrastination isn't a character flaw. It's not about laziness, poor time management, or lack of discipline. At its core, procrastination is a perceptual problem, a specific way of seeing the relationship between intention and action that creates an artificial barrier we'll call the action threshold. This invisible boundary between contemplation and movement feels insurmountable when viewed through the lens of traditional productivity advice. The solution isn't found in better time management or stronger willpower. It lies in a fundamental shift in how you perceive the act of beginning. When you change how you see this threshold, you change your entire relationship with action itself. This book will guide you through a three-part journey of transformation. First, you'll see through the illusions that make the action threshold appear so formidable. Next, you'll discover how to cross this threshold effortlessly, without the usual struggle and resistance. Finally, you'll learn to sustain momentum once in motion, making continued action feel as natural as breathing. By the time you reach the final page, you won't just have new techniques to try. You'll have a fundamentally different relationship with action itself. Procrastination will lose its grip not through constant battle, but through a profound shift in how you perceive the very nature of beginning. This isn't about forcing yourself to be more productive or disciplined. It's about aligning with your mind's natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. It's about discovering that the space between intention and action, a space that once seemed vast and impassable, can collapse in an instant with the right perceptual shift. Welcome to a new understanding of procrastination, not as an enemy to defeat, but as a messenger pointing toward a deeper truth about how your mind works with action. The freedom you've been seeking isn't found in doing more or trying harder. It's found in seeing differently. Chapter 1. The Procrastination Paradox. Sitting before an important task, you feel it building, that invisible force of resistance growing stronger with each passing minute. Your breath becomes shallow, shoulders tensing as thoughts race through well-worn paths of justification. The task itself hasn't changed, yet it seems to loom larger with each moment of delay. Your chest tightens as anxiety whispers of consequences, while your mind crafts increasingly elaborate reasons why now isn't quite the right time to begin. This experience is universal, a pattern so familiar it feels woven into the fabric of human nature. But what if this very moment contains a profound insight about the true nature of procrastination? What if the way you're trying to overcome it is actually making it stronger. Consider what happens when you encounter procrastination's resistance. The typical response is to gather your willpower, steel your resolve, and try to force your way through. This seems logical. When faced with an obstacle, push harder. Yet something counterintuitive happens. The more you fight against procrastination, the more powerful it becomes. Like quicksand, your struggle to escape only pulls you deeper. This is the paradox of resistance amplification. When you frame procrastination as an enemy to be defeated, you inadvertently strengthen the very perception that creates it. Each attempt to overpower procrastination through sheer force of will actually reinforces the idea that starting is inherently difficult. That action requires a mighty effort to overcome some opposing force. You might be thinking, but if I don't fight against procrastination, won't I just give in to it? This reaction is natural, but it reveals a crucial misconception. The choice isn't between fighting and surrendering. There's another way entirely, one that doesn't involve struggle or defeat. When you perceive a task through the lens of resistance, you create an artificial battle between your intention and the act of beginning. This perceived conflict generates tension, and tension seeks release. The more you push, the more your mind pushes back, seeking relief through delay. It's not the task itself creating this dynamic, it's your relationship with it. The shift from pushing through to stepping aside fundamentally transforms the experience of beginning. Instead of gathering force to overcome resistance, you learn to dissolve the perception that creates resistance in the first place. This isn't about techniques or strategies. It's about seeing clearly what's actually happening in the space between intention and action. The reality is that no physical force holds you back from taking action. The resistance you feel isn't a solid wall, it's more like a projected image, appearing solid only because you believe it to be. When you stop engaging with resistance as if it were real, its power begins to fade. This might sound abstract, but its implications are deeply practical. Every time you approach a task, you have a choice. You can brace yourself for battle, reinforcing the perception of difficulty, or you can step back and question the reality of the resistance you feel. Is the task itself actually preventing you from starting, or is your perception of it creating an illusory barrier? The force of procrastination comes not from the tasks you face, but from your relationship with them. By fighting procrastination, you validate and energize the very perception that gives it power. But when you see through this illusion, when you recognize that the resistance isn't inherent in the task, but created by your approach to it, something remarkable happens. The space between intention and action begins to collapse. This insight reveals the futility of traditional anti-procrastination strategies that focus on overpowering resistance. Such approaches may occasionally succeed through brute force, but they leave intact the underlying perception that creates resistance in the first place. True freedom from procrastination comes not from getting better at fighting it, but from seeing through the illusion that makes it appear real. The truth is both simpler and more profound than any technique. What you resist persists. What you embrace dissolves. Chapter 2. The Myth of Motivation. You sit there waiting for that perfect moment when inspiration will strike, when motivation will surge through you like electricity, making the task before you not just manageable but irresistible. The clock ticks. Your phone beckons. Maybe a quick check of social media will spark that creative energy you need. Perhaps organizing your desk one more time will finally create the right environment. You tell yourself these small delays are productive. After all, shouldn't you feel ready before tackling something important? This pattern repeats daily across millions of desks, in countless homes and offices. The belief runs deep. Motivation must come first, then action will follow naturally. It seems logical, intuitive even. Why force yourself to begin when you can wait for that energized state where work flows effortlessly? But this seemingly rational approach harbors a fundamental misunderstanding about how motivation actually works. Consider a train at rest in a station. You might think it needs tremendous power to begin moving, that the engine must build up to full strength before the journey can start. Yet modern trains use significantly less energy to maintain motion than to overcome that initial static friction. The physics of motivation follow a surprisingly similar pattern. Motivation isn't the spark that precedes action. It's the heat generated by movement itself. When you're waiting to feel motivated, you're asking a stationary train to generate the momentum that only comes from motion. This insight transforms our understanding of the relationship between feeling and doing. The conventional wisdom has it exactly backward. Action doesn't emerge from motivation. Motivation emerges from action. Every time you wait for inspiration before beginning, you reinforce a dependency that keeps you stuck. It's the action motivation cycle. Small actions generate small bursts of motivation, which make slightly bigger actions possible, which generate stronger motivation, creating an upward spiral of momentum. You might object, pointing to times when motivation did come first, those moments of natural inspiration that led to productive work sessions. These experiences are real, but building your productivity system around them is like planning your retirement around winning the lottery. These spontaneous motivational states are wonderful when they occur, but they're too rare and unreliable to form the foundation of consistent achievement. The solution isn't to find better ways to summon motivation. It's to remove motivation from the equation entirely. Instead of waiting to feel ready, you learn to take what I call minimum viable action. Steps so small they bypass the need for motivational states altogether. The shift from waiting to feel ready to acting to become ready dissolves the artificial barrier between intention and action. Look at your own experience. When have your most significant accomplishments come from waiting for motivation? How often has that perfect feeling of readiness actually arrived? Consider how many tasks remain unfinished because you're still waiting for the right emotional state to tackle them. This perceptual shift fundamentally transforms the experience of beginning. Rather than motivation being a prerequisite that must be gathered before action, it becomes a natural byproduct of movement. The question changes from, do I feel like doing this, to, what's the smallest step I could take right now? This insight connects to a broader truth about perception versus reality in productivity. Just as optical illusions persist, even after we understand their illusions, the feeling that we need motivation before action can remain strong even when we intellectually recognize its falsehood. The key isn't to fight this feeling, but to step outside its logic entirely. Stop waiting for motivation to arrive like a distant train. True motivation isn't found in the waiting. It's generated in the walking. Every moment spent seeking the perfect emotional state is a moment that could have been spent building the very momentum you seek. Chapter 3. The Beginning Illusion. What if the difficulty of beginning is largely an illusion? The moment of starting looms before you like an invisible wall, a barrier between intention and action that feels solid, imposing, real. You feel it in your body. The subtle tension, the slight withdrawal, the instinctive resistance to crossing that threshold. Your mind races with thoughts about the effort required, the potential challenges ahead, the energy you'll need to muster. The simple act of beginning takes on mountainous proportions in your perception. This experience is so universal. so familiar that questioning its reality might seem absurd. After all, the difficulty of starting feels undeniably real. Your racing heart, churning stomach, and mental resistance all testify to its existence. But what if these sensations aren't evidence of actual difficulty, but rather symptoms of a perceptual illusion? Consider how a mirage works in the desert. From a distance, the water appears absolutely real, a shimmering oasis that seems to possess physical substance and depth. Your mind accepts its reality without question, even though you rationally know it's an optical illusion. The closer you get, the more its apparent solidity dissolves, revealing the empty air that was always there. This phenomenon, which we might call threshold magnification, operates in precisely the same way when it comes to beginning. Your mind creates an exaggerated perception of the effort required to start, projecting an imposing barrier between your current state and the first moment of action. This magnification happens automatically, outside your conscious awareness, making the illusion feel completely real and trustworthy. The anticipatory anxiety about beginning typically far exceeds the actual experience of starting once you're in motion. Think about the last time you postponed a task for hours or days, only to find that once you finally began, the dreaded difficulty never materialized. The resistance, the mental projection of effort, the perceived complexity, all dissolved the moment you took that first small step. You might be thinking, but sometimes beginning really is difficult. Sometimes it does require significant effort. This is absolutely true. And yet, how much of that difficulty is inherent in the action itself? And how much is constructed by your anticipation? When you examine moments of effortless beginning in your life, those times when you started something without resistance or hesitation, what was different about your perception in those moments? The key lies in understanding that the act of beginning isn't actually a single dramatic moment requiring a burst of effort. This perception creates unnecessary resistance. Instead, beginning can be diffused across multiple microscopic steps, each requiring virtually no effort at all. Rather than facing a vertical wall that demands a powerful leap, you can create a gentle slope that you naturally glide down. This perceptual shift transforms the experience of starting. Instead of gathering force to breach an invisible barrier, you simply allow yourself to take actions so small they bypass the mind's tendency to magnify difficulty. The threshold between inaction and action becomes nearly imperceptible, like stepping from one room to another rather than scaling a wall. When you combine this insight with what we've learned about resistance amplification and the motivation myth, a clear picture emerges. The conventional approach to beginning, gathering force to overcome a perceived barrier while waiting for motivation, actually creates the perfect conditions for procrastination. The more you see beginning as a difficult threshold to cross, the more your mind magnifies that threshold, and the more you wait for motivation to help you overcome it. The reality is far simpler. The wall between intention and action exists primarily in perception, and what exists in perception can dissolve in an instant. When you understand this truth deeply, you start to see how your mind creates these imaginary barriers, turning simple actions into daunting obstacles. Yet these same barriers can vanish the moment you recognize their illusory nature, much like a mirage that disappears once you understand what you're really seeing. Chapter 4. The Future Self Disconnect. Imagine standing face to face with your future self, not a vague, abstract notion, but the actual you who will wake up tomorrow, next week, or next year to experience the consequences of your choices today. Take a moment to truly sense their presence. What would they say about the decisions you're making right now? What emotions cross their face as they witness you postponing the very actions that could make their life better? This isn't just a thought experiment. It's a profound window into one of procrastination's deepest mechanisms. The gap between your present and future self creates a perceptual blind spot that procrastination exploits with remarkable efficiency. When you delay an important task, you're not just postponing work. You're actively transferring burden to someone who feels strangely distant from your current experience, despite being the same consciousness occupying a different moment in time. This temporal disconnect manifests in subtle but powerful ways. When you scroll through social media, instead of working on that important project, your mind creates an artificial boundary between the present moment of pleasure and the future moment of consequence. The future you who will face that looming deadline feels like a different person. Someone who will somehow be more equipped, more motivated, or more capable of handling what you're avoiding now. This perception of the future self as a separate entity, rather than a continuous extension of your present experience, fundamentally alters how you make decisions. You wouldn't walk into someone else's home and leave a mess for them to clean up. Yet you regularly borrow time from your future self, leaving them to deal with accumulated tasks, compressed deadlines, and mounting pressure. The brain's tendency to create this psychological distance is rooted in how we process time itself. Just as your mind creates artificial barriers between contemplation and action, it fabricates boundaries between different moments of your ongoing experience. This fragmentation makes it easier to rationalize choices that benefit the present at the expense of the future. Understanding this temporal disconnect reveals why traditional time management strategies often fail. When you perceive your future self as a separate entity, no amount of scheduling or planning can bridge the emotional gap that makes procrastination possible. The solution isn't better organization. It's collapsing the perceived distance between present and future consciousness. This shift occurs when you recognize that time doesn't flow in discrete chunks, but in a continuous stream of experience. Your future self isn't another person waiting to receive the consequences of your choices. It's you, experiencing those consequences in real time as they unfold from present decisions. This realization transforms how you perceive the act of delay. Postponing a task no longer feels like borrowing time. It feels like actively creating difficulty for yourself. The distinction is crucial. Borrowing implies future repayment to another entity, while creating difficulty acknowledges direct responsibility to your own continuous experience. When you maintain artificial separation from your future self, each moment of procrastination feels like a small, isolated choice. But when you collapse this temporal distance, you immediately sense how present actions ripple through time, affecting not some abstract future version of you, but your continuous stream of experience. This recognition fundamentally shifts your relationship with delay. The question changes from, "Why not wait until later?" to, "Why would I intentionally make things harder for myself?" The very perception that enables procrastination, the illusion of separation between present and future experience, dissolves in the face of this temporal continuity. Think of it like writing a story. Each sentence flows into the next, creating a coherent narrative. You wouldn't randomly insert obstacles into your story, making it harder to reach a satisfying conclusion. Yet when you procrastinate, you're doing exactly that, inserting unnecessary complications into the ongoing story of your experience. You're voluntarily choosing a more difficult path, creating obstacles that your future self must navigate. Chapter 5: The Permission Paradox. You've experienced it countless times, that compelling urge to have everything perfectly aligned before beginning. The workspace must be immaculate, the plan comprehensive, the timing ideal, and your energy levels optimal. Each preparation step feels crucial, necessary, and responsible. Yet somehow, these prerequisites keep multiplying, pushing the moment of actual engagement perpetually beyond reach. This isn't just perfectionism, it's a sophisticated form of permission-seeking that keeps you safely in the realm of preparation rather than risking actual engagement. What appears as diligence often masks a deeper pattern. The need for perfect conditions becomes an unconscious strategy to avoid the vulnerability of beginning. Consider how this manifests in your own life. Perhaps you're waiting to start a fitness routine until you can commit to the perfect schedule. Or you're postponing that important project until you've gathered every possible piece of information. Or maybe you're delaying a crucial conversation until you feel completely ready. Each scenario appears rational on the surface. After all, shouldn't we be well prepared? But this seemingly responsible approach conceals a subtle truth. Perfect conditions are a mirage that recedes as you approach it. The permission paradox reveals itself in this pattern. The more conditions you set for beginning, the more elusive starting becomes. Each prerequisite spawns new prerequisites, creating an endless chain of preparation that never quite reaches the threshold of action. What begins as prudent planning transforms into a sophisticated form of avoidance, all while maintaining the illusion of progress. This perspective shift illuminates why traditional advice about being prepared often backfires. When preparation becomes a form of permission-seeking, it creates an artificial gateway to action that can never be fully satisfied. The mind, in its infinite creativity, will always find one more thing that needs to be perfect before you can begin. The psychology behind this pattern runs deep. By creating elaborate conditions for action, you establish a buffer zone between intention and execution. This buffer zone feels safe. It allows you to maintain the identity of someone who will act without actually having to face the vulnerability of action itself. You remain in the comfortable space of potential rather than stepping into the uncertain territory of actual engagement. Yet this comfort comes at a significant cost. Every moment spent waiting for perfect conditions is a moment of real progress lost. The energy invested in preparation often exceeds what the actual task would require. More importantly, this pattern reinforces the belief that you need external validation or perfect circumstances to act, weakening your ability to authorize your own engagement. The path beyond this pattern lies not in better preparation, but in recognizing your authority to grant yourself permission in this moment. This shift transforms preparation from a prerequisite to a parallel process, something that enhances action rather than delaying it. Instead of waiting for everything to be right, you acknowledge that beginning itself creates conditions for improvement. This doesn't mean abandoning preparation entirely. Rather, it means recognizing the difference between preparation that enables action and preparation that postpones it. The key lies in your relationship with imperfection. When you truly understand that perfect conditions are an illusion, you free yourself to begin with what you have, where you are. The permission paradox dissolves when you realize that readiness isn't something that precedes action. It's something that emerges through engagement. Each moment spent waiting for perfect conditions is actually a moment of choosing imperfect inaction over imperfect action. The question transforms from, "Am I ready?" to, "Am I willing to engage with imperfection?" This insight connects deeply with the temporal disconnect explored earlier. Just as you can bridge the gap with your future self, you can bridge the gap between your current state and your idealized conditions for action. The perfect moment isn't something that arrives. It's something you create by beginning, despite imperfection. The walls of permission-seeking begin to crumble when you recognize your own authority to act. You don't need everything to be perfect. You need only to grant yourself permission to begin in the midst of imperfection. This shift transforms preparation from a barrier to a foundation, from a prerequisite to a companion of action. Your hesitation dissolves as you embrace the truth that authority doesn't come from external validation, but emerges from within. Each time you wait for someone else's approval, you unknowingly surrender your power to shape your own path. The real permission slip has always been in your hands, waiting for your signature. When you finally claim this authority, preparation becomes what it was always meant to be. Not a shield against action, but a resource that enriches your journey as you move forward. Chapter 6: The Focus Fallacy. You sit down determined to concentrate, gripping your attention like a leash you're trying to control. Your mind wanders and you pull it back. It drifts again and you tighten your grip. Each time you force your focus back to the task, it seems to resist even more strongly, like trying to hold water in clenched fists. The harder you try to concentrate, the more elusive true focus becomes. This battle for attention feels increasingly familiar in our hyper-connected world. Notifications ping, emails flood in, and social media beckons with endless scrolling. The typical response is to double down on discipline, to try even harder to force concentration through sheer willpower. But what if this fundamental approach to focus is exactly what's making it so difficult to achieve? The truth about concentration is counterintuitive. Focus isn't something you capture through force. It's a state that emerges naturally when the right conditions are present. Think of focus as a shy forest animal. The more aggressively you chase it, the faster it runs away. But create the right environment, remain patient and still, and it approaches on its own. This isn't just a poetic metaphor. It's supported by our understanding of how the brain naturally directs attention. When you try to force focus, you activate the brain's stress response, triggering the release of cortisol and adrenaline. These stress hormones actually make it harder to maintain sustained attention, creating a self-defeating cycle, where the harder you try to focus, the more your biology works against you. In contrast, when you're genuinely engaged in something interesting, perhaps lost in a compelling book, or absorbed in solving a puzzle, focus arrives effortlessly. You don't have to fight to maintain attention because your brain's natural curiosity and reward systems are activated, creating an optimal state for concentration. The key shift is moving from commanding focus to inviting it. This means working with your brain's natural tendencies rather than against them. When you structure tasks and environments to align with how your attention naturally flows, concentration becomes less of a battle and more of a natural emergence. Consider how a task feels when you're trying to force focus. There's tension, resistance, and a constant need to redirect your wandering mind. Now contrast this with moments of natural engagement. Time seems to flow differently. Distractions fade into the background, and maintaining attention requires little conscious effort. This isn't to suggest that discipline has no place in maintaining focus. Rather, it's about understanding that willpower alone is an inefficient and ultimately unsuccessful approach to sustained concentration. The goal is to create conditions where focus arises naturally, requiring far less energy to maintain. The brain's attention system responds powerfully to novelty, challenge, and personal relevance. When you frame tasks to incorporate these elements, you tap into your natural capacity for engagement rather than fighting against your mind's tendency to wander. Instead of trying to chain your attention to an unengaging task, transform how you approach the task itself. Pay attention to those rare moments when focus comes easily. What conditions are present? How does the task feel different? What's your mental state? These instances of natural concentration offer crucial clues about your personal patterns of engagement. The fundamental shift is from seeing focus as something you do to recognizing it as something that happens when you create the right conditions. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but it transforms the entire experience of concentration from a draining battle into a natural flow state. This alignment with your brain's natural functioning extends beyond just focus. It's part of a broader pattern you've seen throughout this book, the power of working with, rather than against your mind's inherent tendencies. Just as fighting procrastination strengthens its hold and waiting for motivation keeps you stuck, trying to force focus often achieves the opposite of what you intend. The solution isn't to try harder, it's to try differently. By understanding and working with your brain's natural attention mechanisms, you can create an environment and approach that makes focus feel less like a forced march and more like a natural state of flow. When you align your actions with how your mind naturally operates, concentration transforms from something you chase to something that emerges on its own. You'll find yourself slipping into deep focus without the exhausting mental struggle that usually accompanies it, much like how water naturally flows downhill rather than needing to be pushed. Chapter 7. The Minimum Viable Action. Standing before a mountain of work triggers an almost visceral response in your body. Your breathing becomes shallow, your shoulders tense, and your mind begins cycling through all the complexity ahead. Whether it's a major project deadline, an overwhelming list of tasks, or a creative endeavor that seems to have no clear starting point, the sheer magnitude of what lies ahead can create instant paralysis. This paralysis isn't just psychological, it manifests physically. Your body interprets the perceived size of the task as actual physical weight, triggering stress responses that make movement feel impossible. The more you contemplate the entirety of what needs to be done, the more overwhelming it becomes, creating a feedback loop of increasing resistance. But this perception of tasks as monolithic wholes is an illusion, one that creates unnecessary suffering and resistance. When you see a project as an indivisible mountain that must be scaled in a single bound, you're setting yourself up for paralysis. The truth is that no task, no matter how complex, exists as a single unit. Every mountain is made of individual grains of sand. Every project is composed of microscopic actions that, when taken in sequence, create meaningful progress. This brings us to the transformative concept of the minimum viable action, MVA, the smallest possible step that still counts as forward movement. Not the first logical step, not the first important step, but the first possible step, no matter how seemingly insignificant. The MVA is often far smaller than what most would consider a real first step, and that's precisely its power. Think of crossing a wide river. Attempting to leap across in a single bound is not only impossible, it's dangerous. But place stepping stones across that same river, each one close enough that stepping from one to the next requires almost no effort. And suddenly, the impossible becomes inevitable. Each stone represents an MVA, a step so small, it bypasses the mind's threat detection system entirely. The psychology behind this approach is profound. The mind's threat detection system, designed to protect us from danger, often misinterprets large tasks as threats. This triggers resistance mechanisms that make beginning feel unnecessarily difficult. But when an action is sufficiently small, it flies under the radar of this threat detection system. The mind doesn't bother mounting resistance because the action seems too insignificant to worry about. You might argue that taking such tiny steps feels inefficient. Surely it would be better to take larger, more meaningful strides. This objection comes from the same thinking that creates paralysis in the first place. The belief that progress must be significant to be worthwhile. The paradox is that attempting larger steps often results in no movement at all, while embracing microscopic movement creates momentum that naturally accelerates over time. Consider how water crosses barriers. It doesn't attempt to break through in one forceful surge. It finds the smallest possible entry points and moves through them drop by drop. Yet given enough time, water can carve canyons through solid rock. This is the power of the MVA approach. By reducing resistance to nearly zero, it ensures movement happens, and sustained movement, no matter how small initially, creates transformation. The key is identifying genuine MVAs, actions so small they feel almost trivial. Opening a document but not writing anything. Putting on running shoes but not committing to exercise. Reading a single paragraph of research. These actions might seem meaninglessly small, but they serve a crucial function. They cross the action threshold with minimal resistance. And once that threshold is crossed, continuing becomes dramatically easier. This isn't about tricking yourself into doing more. It's about recognizing that the perceived size of necessary first steps is often vastly inflated. When you let go of the need for significant initial progress and embrace the power of microscopic movement, you transform the emotional experience of beginning from dread to ease. The size of your first step determines whether you take it. Make it small enough to be undeniable, and you'll find yourself in motion before resistance has a chance to arise. This isn't about lowering your standards or settling for less. It's about understanding that all significant achievements begin with a single, often tiny, movement forward. Chapter 8. The Momentum Principle. The fundamental laws of physics reveal a profound truth about human behavior. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest, while objects in motion tend to stay in motion. This principle, known as Newton's first law, perfectly captures the essence of your struggle with procrastination and productivity. When you're stuck in inaction, remaining stationary feels like your natural state. Yet once you're moving forward, continuing becomes almost effortless. This isn't just a convenient analogy. It reflects a deep psychological reality about how your mind interacts with action. Just as physical objects require more energy to begin moving than to continue moving, your mind requires significantly more psychological energy to initiate a task than to maintain progress once begun. Understanding this activation energy curve transforms how you approach any challenging endeavor. Think of pushing a heavy boulder up a hill. The initial force required is immense. You're working against both gravity and inertia. But once you reach the crest, something remarkable happens. Not only does the effort required decrease dramatically, but gravity itself begins working in your favor, creating momentum that pulls the boulder forward with minimal additional input from you. Your mind operates on remarkably similar principles. The resistance you feel before beginning a task, that heaviness, that reluctance, that sense of effort required, is actually a temporary spike in perceived difficulty that peaks just before initiation. Yet most people misinterpret this spike as representative of the entire task, creating unnecessary resistance by assuming the intense effort required for beginning will be sustained throughout. This misperception leads to overestimating the total energy required for completion, while underestimating your capacity to generate psychological momentum. When you understand that the majority of your resistance is concentrated in that initial moment of beginning, you can stop seeing it as a signal to avoid action and start recognizing it as a natural part of the initiation phase, one that will dissipate once momentum takes over. The psychological mechanisms behind this phenomenon are fascinating. Your brain is constantly trying to conserve energy by maintaining its current state. Beginning something new requires overriding this conservation instinct, which triggers temporary resistance. However, once action begins, your brain adapts to the new state of activity, often finding it more rewarding to continue than to stop and have to overcome initial resistance again. Some might argue that not all tasks develop a natural flow or become easier with time. This is true. Certain activities maintain a consistent level of difficulty throughout. However, even these tasks benefit from momentum in terms of reduced cognitive friction. The mental energy required to continue an action is almost always less than the energy required to start, stop, and restart repeatedly. This insight reveals why traditional approaches to productivity often fail. When you try to force yourself to be productive through constant application of willpower, you're fighting against your mind's natural momentum principles. Instead, by understanding the physics of psychological momentum, you can structure your approach to maximize the natural tendency of sustained action. The key lies in recognizing that momentum isn't just a consequence of action. It's a force you can deliberately generate and harness. By designing what we might call momentum hooks, small actions specifically chosen to generate psychological momentum, you can create a self-sustaining cycle of progress. These hooks work by lowering the initial energy requirement while maximizing the natural tendency toward continued action. Consider the difference between forcing yourself to work through sheer willpower versus creating conditions where momentum naturally carries you forward. In the first scenario, every moment requires conscious effort to maintain progress. In the second, initial effort gives way to a state where continuation feels more natural than stopping. The relationship between momentum and the minimum viable action principle becomes clear. Those tiny initial steps serve not just to make beginning easier, but to generate the momentum that makes continuation natural. Each small action builds upon the last, creating a compound effect that transforms the experience of progress from forced march to natural flow. This principle holds true across every domain of action, from creative work to exercise to daily tasks. Understanding the physics of psychological momentum doesn't just make individual tasks easier. It fundamentally transforms your relationship with action itself. Momentum isn't just about keeping going. It's about recognizing that the barrier between inaction and action is far more temporary than it appears. The resistance you feel before beginning is not a wall to be climbed, but a threshold to be crossed, after which the very physics of progress begin working in your favor. Chapter 9. The Decision Illusion. You're sitting at your desk, and for the 5th time today, you're debating whether to start that important project. Each time the task crosses your mind, you engage in the same exhausting mental dialogue. Should I begin now? Maybe after lunch it would be better, but wouldn't it be good to get it done early? Then again, my energy might be higher later. This internal negotiation plays out not just once, but dozens of times throughout your day, draining your mental resources before you've even touched the actual work. What you may not realize is that this constant deliberation, this perpetual weighing of whether to act or delay, creates a hidden tax on your mental energy. Each time you revisit the decision to begin, you're depleting the same finite reserve of willpower you'll need for the task itself. The real drain isn't coming from the work you need to do, but from the repeated decision about whether to do it. This reveals a counterintuitive truth about procrastination. Much of its power stems from the illusion that beginning is optional. When you perceive starting as a choice that must be made anew each time the task enters your awareness, you create an unnecessary cognitive burden that compounds throughout your day. Think of it like the difference between driving a car and riding a train. When driving, you must constantly make decisions: when to turn, which route to take, how to respond to traffic. Each choice requires attention and energy. But on a train, the path is predetermined. Once you've committed to the journey, the tracks eliminate thousands of micro-decisions, allowing you to direct your energy toward more meaningful pursuits. This same principle applies to your relationship with tasks. When you leave the question of whether open for constant renegotiation, you force your mind to expend energy on the same decision repeatedly. But when you eliminate the illusion of choice around certain commitments, you free yourself from this cyclical drain on your mental resources. The key insight here isn't about removing all choice from your life. It's about recognizing which decisions deserve fresh consideration and which are better settled once and protected from endless revisitation. By establishing clear parameters around when and how certain tasks will be executed, you create mental tracks that guide your actions without requiring constant deliberation. When you examine the most productive periods in your life, you'll likely find they were characterized not by endless flexibility, but by clear structures that eliminated unnecessary decision points. The morning routine that runs like clockwork, the workout schedule that happens without internal debate, the writing practice that unfolds at the same time each day. These are examples of decision elimination in action. The power of this approach lies in its ability to bypass the very mechanism that makes procrastination possible. When action becomes the default rather than a choice requiring active decision, the mental friction that typically precedes beginning simply dissolves. You move from "should I start" to "this is what happens now," a subtle but transformative shift in how you engage with your commitments. This isn't about rigid inflexibility or denying your autonomy. Rather, it's about strategically choosing which decisions deserve your mental energy and which are better served by predetermined pathways. By eliminating decisions that don't meaningfully contribute to your goals, you conserve willpower for the creative and strategic choices that truly matter. The most powerful aspect of decision elimination is how it compounds over time. Each pre-committed action pattern you establish creates a groove in your mental landscape that makes future action along that path increasingly effortless. Like a well-worn trail through a forest, these pathways become your mind's natural routes, requiring less energy to traverse with each passing day. The resistance you feel toward tasks often has less to do with the tasks themselves and more to do with the weight of repeatedly deciding to do them. By removing this layer of constant choice, you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of deliberation that precedes action. When you shift from seeing certain tasks as optional to viewing them as simply what happens, you transform your relationship from the beginning. The energy previously spent on deciding whether to act becomes available for the action itself, creating a natural flow that makes procrastination increasingly difficult to maintain. This perception shift, from perpetual choice to predetermined action, fundamentally changes how you engage with your commitments. The mental framework moves from "should I" to "this is what happens now," eliminating the cognitive burden of repeated decision-making and creating clear pathways for consistent action. True freedom doesn't come from maintaining endless options at every moment. It comes from strategically eliminating decisions that drain your mental resources without adding meaningful value to your life. By establishing clear action patterns for your most important commitments, you create the mental space needed for genuine creativity and meaningful choice in areas where flexibility truly matters. Chapter 10: The Resistance Dance. When you try to overcome procrastination through force, you enter a battle that leaves both sides wounded. Your body tenses, your jaw clenches, and your mind fills with self-directed commands to just do it. This approach seems logical. If something resists movement, surely applying more force will overcome that resistance. Yet this intuitive response often strengthens the very barrier you're trying to break through. Consider how your system responds to force. When you push against resistance with raw willpower, your body interprets this as a threat response, triggering a cascade of stress hormones that actually make it harder to think clearly and act effectively. The harder you push, the more your system pushes back, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of tension and resistance. The revolutionary insight here isn't about finding more effective ways to fight resistance. It's about transforming your entire relationship with it. Just as a skilled Aikido master redirects an opponent's energy rather than meeting it head-on, you can learn to work with your resistance rather than against it. This isn't passive acceptance or surrender. It's a sophisticated form of engagement that turns resistance from an opponent into a partner. When you approach resistance with curiosity rather than combat, something remarkable happens. Instead of bracing against it, try asking what this resistance is trying to tell you. Often, it carries valuable information about your relationship with the task, your current energy levels, or unacknowledged fears that deserve attention. By listening to resistance rather than trying to silence it, you gain insights that can make action more natural and sustainable. This shift from fighting to flowing doesn't mean you never face your resistance directly. There will be times when decisive action against inner reluctance is necessary. However, the key distinction lies in recognizing when force creates unnecessary struggle. Much like trying to relax through gritted teeth, pushing harder often generates the exact tension you're trying to overcome. The practical application of this insight begins with what I call resistance dialogue, an internal conversation that acknowledges and explores your reluctance rather than trying to override it. Instead of commanding yourself to act, you might ask, "What's making this feel difficult right now?" Or, "What would make this task feel more approachable?" This simple shift from command to inquiry often reveals solutions that were hidden by the struggle. The transformation becomes evident when you contrast the traditional approach with this more nuanced engagement. Instead of tensing up and forcing yourself to start, you might pause to feel the full weight of your resistance, understanding that this acknowledgement often naturally diffuses its power. Rather than berating yourself for procrastinating, you explore what this particular form of delay might be protecting or preparing you for. This isn't about finding clever ways to procrastinate. It's about developing a more sophisticated relationship with your own patterns of resistance. When you stop treating resistance as the enemy, you'll often find it naturally transforms into useful energy that actually supports rather than hinders action. Your resistance patterns carry wisdom if you're willing to listen. Sometimes they're protecting you from overcommitment or signaling that a project needs more refinement before execution. Other times, they're highlighting fears that, once acknowledged, lose their paralyzing power. By engaging with resistance as information rather than obstacle, you transform what was once a source of frustration into a valuable guidance system. This approach complements rather than contradicts the momentum principles we explored earlier. By reducing the initial friction through acceptance rather than force, you make it easier to initiate the small actions that generate natural momentum. Similarly, when minimum viable actions feel overwhelming, dialogue with resistance often reveals even smaller starting points that feel more accessible. Think of resistance as a dance partner rather than an opponent. In a dance, both partners move together, each responding to and supporting the other's movement. When you fight resistance, you create tension that makes movement harder. When you dance with it, you discover paths of natural flow that make action feel almost effortless. What emerges is a more nuanced and effective approach to procrastination, one that works with your natural tendencies rather than against them. This isn't about becoming more disciplined in your fight against resistance. It's about becoming more skillful in your engagement with it. The path forward often becomes clear, not through force, but through understanding. Chapter 11. The Starting Ritual. Throughout human history, rituals have served as bridges between different states of being. From ancient ceremonies to modern pre-game routines, humans have instinctively understood that consistent sequences of actions help navigate important transitions. This universal pattern reveals a profound truth about human psychology. We naturally respond to symbolic actions that mark clear boundaries between states. The power of ritual lies not in any mystical property, but in its ability to bypass the conscious mind's resistance. When you establish a consistent starting sequence, you create neural pathways that make action semi-automatic, reducing the dependency on fluctuating willpower or motivation. Think of a starting ritual as a bridge across the action threshold, one that becomes increasingly stable and familiar with each crossing. The neuroscience behind ritual effectiveness is clear. Repeated sequences of actions create stronger neural pathways, making the transition to work more automatic over time. This process engages deeper, more primitive brain systems that operate below the level of conscious resistance. Your brain begins to recognize the ritual as a signal to shift states, much like how certain bedtime routines trigger your body to prepare for sleep. The beauty of starting rituals lies in their simplicity and consistency rather than their complexity. The specific actions matter less than their reliable repetition. This could be as basic as arranging your workspace in a particular way, putting on specific music, or performing a brief breathing exercise. The key is that these actions consistently precede productive work, creating a clear demarcation between preparation and engagement. Some worry that rituals might become rigid constraints, but structure paradoxically creates freedom by eliminating the friction of reinventing your approach each time. When you remove the burden of deciding how to begin, you conserve mental energy for the work itself. This is why many successful creators maintain seemingly arbitrary but consistent pre-work routines. They understand that the routine itself matters less than its role in facilitating the transition to focused work. The most effective starting rituals align with your natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. They should feel like stepping stones across a stream rather than obstacles to overcome. This might mean incorporating elements of physical movement if you're kinesthetically oriented, or using ambient sounds if you're auditorily sensitive. The goal is to create a sequence that feels supportive rather than restrictive. Starting rituals also serve as environmental anchors, creating consistent cues that signal to your brain it's time to engage. This could involve specific locations, times of day, or sensory experiences that become associated with productive states. Over time, these anchors strengthen, making the transition to work increasingly automatic. For tasks that typically provoke procrastination, starting rituals become especially powerful. They provide a way to begin without directly confronting the task's perceived difficulty. By focusing on the familiar steps of your ritual, you sidestep the mental resistance that often accompanies challenging work. It's like entering cold water gradually rather than diving in. Each step of the ritual acclimates you to the transition. The most sustainable starting rituals grow organically from your existing patterns rather than being imposed from outside. Pay attention to the sequences that naturally precede your most productive periods. What elements consistently appear? How could these be deliberately structured into a more formal ritual? This organic approach ensures your rituals remain authentic to your working style. When designing starting rituals, simplicity is crucial. Complex routines create their own resistance and are less likely to be maintained. The ideal ritual contains just enough structure to create a clear transition while remaining easy to execute consistently. Think of it as creating the minimum viable ceremony, just enough formality to signal the shift without becoming burdensome. Starting rituals also serve as decision eliminators, removing the constant internal debate about how and when to begin. Once established, they convert what was once a series of conscious choices into a single, flowing sequence. This dramatically reduces decision fatigue and conserves willpower for the actual work. Each engagement with your starting ritual strengthens its power, creating deeper neural pathways that make future transitions easier. It's like wearing a path through tall grass. Each crossing makes the next one clearer and more inviting. Over time, the ritual becomes less about consciously preparing to work and more about naturally flowing into your productive state. Chapter 12. The Environment Effect. Your physical and digital environment shapes your actions far more profoundly than most realize. Every object, notification, and element of your surroundings creates either a pathway toward action or an invitation to delay. This invisible influence operates continuously, steering behavior through countless small nudges that accumulate into powerful behavioral patterns. Consider the fundamental difference between environments designed for action versus those that enable procrastination. When your surroundings make productive behavior the path of least resistance, procrastination requires conscious effort. Conversely, when your environment facilitates distraction, even the strongest intention can crumble under the constant friction of working against your surroundings. This friction architecture determines whether you expend energy pushing against your environment or receive support from it. The layout of your workspace, the notifications on your devices, the placement of both tools and temptations. Each element either adds friction to starting or smooths your path to action. Even minor environmental adjustments can dramatically shift the effort required to begin. The power of environmental design lies in its ability to influence behavior without requiring constant conscious effort. While willpower depletes with use, a well-designed environment maintains its influence consistently, creating an invisible support structure for productive action. This approach acknowledges human nature rather than fighting against it, making desired behaviors easier and undesired ones more difficult. The concept of friction architecture reveals why traditional approaches focusing solely on internal factors often fail. When your environment contradicts your intentions, you must constantly overcome its influence through willpower alone. This creates unnecessary struggle that depletes mental resources better spent on actual work. Your digital environment deserves particular attention in this era of constant connectivity. Every notification, app layout, and online workspace either reinforces focus or invites distraction. The seemingly small decision of where to place your phone while working, for instance, can have outsized effects on your ability to maintain concentration. Environmental design operates through both addition and subtraction, creating supportive structures while removing elements that enable procrastination. This might mean establishing dedicated workspaces while eliminating visual triggers that prompt delay. The goal isn't to create perfectly sterile environments, but to thoughtfully curate surroundings that naturally guide you toward intended actions. Consider how professional environments embody this principle. Operating rooms are meticulously designed to make proper procedure the default behavior. Libraries naturally encourage focus through their layout and atmosphere. These environments don't force specific behaviors, but make desired actions feel natural and effortless. The same principles apply to your personal workspace. Every object either serves as a launching pad for action or creates a potential detour toward delay. By deliberately designing your environment, you can create natural pathways toward productivity while gently steering yourself away from procrastination triggers. This approach doesn't deny personal responsibility, but rather acknowledges how environment and behavior intertwine. Just as a well-designed kitchen makes healthy eating easier, a well-designed workspace makes productive action more natural. The environment becomes an ally in your intentions rather than an obstacle to overcome. The process begins with a thorough examination of your current surroundings, both physical and digital. Notice which elements consistently enable focus and which tend to prompt delay. Pay attention to the subtle ways your environment either supports or undermines your intentions. This awareness reveals opportunities for strategic modification. Your environment shouldn't feel like a prison, but rather a supportive space that aligns with your goals. Small adjustments often yield significant results. Repositioning your desk to face away from distractions, creating dedicated spaces for specific activities, or establishing clear boundaries between work and relaxation areas. Each modification reduces the friction between intention and action. The digital realm offers particularly powerful opportunities for environmental design. Notification settings, app layouts, and digital workspaces can be optimized to maintain focus rather than fragmenting attention. By deliberately structuring these elements, you create an invisible support system for sustained action. This environmental approach proves especially powerful because it works regardless of motivation levels. Even on days when willpower runs low, a well-designed environment continues guiding behavior in intended directions. The surroundings themselves become silent allies, gently steering you toward productive choices without requiring conscious effort. When fatigue sets in or stress mounts, your carefully crafted environment maintains its subtle influence, creating a path of least resistance toward meaningful action rather than distraction. The beauty of this strategy lies in its passive nature. Once established, these environmental supports operate continuously in the background, reducing the daily drain on your limited willpower reserves. Chapter 13. The Completion Threshold. The perpetual state of almost done represents one of procrastination's most subtle yet powerful manifestations. You're past the challenge of beginning, you've maintained momentum through the middle stages, yet something stops you from taking those final steps toward completion. This form of delay often feels more sophisticated than simple procrastination. After all, you've already done most of the work. But leaving tasks perpetually near finished creates its own form of psychological burden, one that accumulates as your life fills with partially completed projects. This completion resistance emerges from a fundamentally different psychological landscape than initial procrastination. While beginning requires overcoming inertia, completion involves facing evaluation, embracing imperfection, and accepting the transformation of potential into reality. The completion threshold represents a second river crossing on your journey, one that requires its own distinct approach and understanding. When you approach completion, the stakes suddenly feel higher. The abstract potential of an unfinished project must crystallize into concrete reality, exposing your work to evaluation, criticism, or simply the harsh light of finality. This transition often triggers deep-seated fears: fear of judgment, fear of imperfection, even fear of success and its implications for future expectations. The safety of almost done can become oddly comfortable, protecting you from these confrontations while maintaining the illusion of progress. The psychology behind completion resistance reveals fascinating patterns. As projects near their end, perfectionism often intensifies rather than diminishes. The closer you get to finishing, the more details you notice that could be improved, creating an endless loop of refinement that prevents actual completion. Additionally, identity protection mechanisms activate more strongly at this stage. If you never quite finish, you never have to fully test your capabilities or confront potential limitations. Yet this protection comes at a significant cost. Unfinished projects drain mental energy through the Zeigarnik effect, your mind's tendency to maintain attention on incomplete tasks. Each almost done project becomes a small but persistent cognitive burden, accumulating into a background noise of unfulfilled commitments that impacts your overall psychological well-being. The completion threshold requires a fundamentally different approach than the initial action threshold. While beginning benefits from reducing friction and making actions smaller, completion often requires expanding your comfort with imperfection and reframing your relationship with evaluation. The goal isn't to lower your standards, but to recognize that completion itself holds value, independent of perfection. The psychology of completion reveals why traditional productivity advice often falls short at this stage. Tips about breaking tasks into smaller pieces or maintaining momentum miss the deeper psychological dynamics at play when facing completion. The resistance here isn't about effort or capability. It's about identity, evaluation, and the courage to transform potential into reality. This insight transforms how you approach the final stages of projects. Instead of seeing completion as a high-pressure finale that must meet every possible standard, you can recognize it as a natural landing point, the logical conclusion of the work you've already done. This shift in perception often dissolves the artificial barrier between almost done and done, making completion feel as natural as any other stage of the process. The completion threshold represents a crucial second crossing point in your journey from intention to achievement. Understanding its unique psychological characteristics allows you to approach it with appropriate strategies rather than trying to force your way through with sheer willpower or momentum. This recognition that completion resistance differs fundamentally from initial procrastination opens new possibilities for moving projects, from perpetual progress to actual completion. By transforming how you perceive the act of finishing, you can begin to see completion not as a fearsome final judgment, but as a natural progression. The simple act of allowing your work to exist in its completed form, imperfections and all. This perspective shift often dissolves the artificial barrier between almost done and done, making completion feel as natural as any other stage of the process. Beginning creates potential. Completion creates reality. Bridges us to exploring how meaning serves as a natural magnet for action. When you align your efforts with deeply meaningful outcomes, procrastination loses its grip on your mind. Your work transforms from an obligation into an expression of purpose, drawing you forward with the magnetic pull of genuine significance. This shift from pushing yourself to being pulled by meaning changes everything about how you approach your tasks. You'll find yourself naturally gravitating toward completion, not because you should, but because the inherent value of your work creates its own momentum. The artificial barriers between you and action dissolve when your focus shifts from what you must do to what you're creating in the world. Your energy flows naturally toward outcomes that matter, making procrastination increasingly irrelevant to your experience. Chapter 14. The Meaning Magnet. When you stand before two seemingly identical tasks, something fascinating happens. One feels like pushing a boulder uphill. Every movement requires conscious effort and sustained willpower. The other seems to draw you forward naturally, as if an invisible force pulls you toward completion. This stark contrast reveals a fundamental truth about human behavior. The presence or absence of meaning radically transforms your relationship with action. The distinction goes far deeper than simple preference or momentary motivation. Consider how effortlessly you can spend hours pursuing something that matters deeply to you, while struggling to focus for even 15 minutes on work that feels meaningless. This isn't coincidence or character. It's the meaning magnet principle in action. Your mind operates like a sophisticated meaning detection system, constantly evaluating activities through the lens of significance. When it encounters tasks connected to your core values and larger purpose, it generates an automatic gravitational pull, making action feel natural and almost inevitable. Conversely, when faced with work that seems disconnected from what matters, your mind creates subtle but persistent resistance, making procrastination the path of least resistance. This explains why traditional productivity approaches often fall short. They attempt to override this natural meaning-seeking mechanism through discipline and external pressure. But fighting against your mind's inherent tendencies is like swimming upstream, possible, but unnecessarily exhausting. Working with this meaning attraction system rather than against it transforms the entire experience of taking action. Understanding this mechanism reveals why procrastination often has less to do with the actual difficulty of tasks and more to do with their perceived significance. Time management techniques and organizational systems can help, but they don't address this deeper dynamic. When meaning is present, complex tasks can feel engaging and energizing. When meaning is absent, even simple actions can feel like walking through mud. The key insight is that meaning isn't just a nice bonus that makes work more pleasant. It's the primary fuel that powers sustained action. Your mind moves naturally toward what feels significant and automatically away from what seems pointless, regardless of rewards, deadlines, or consequences. This isn't a flaw to overcome, but a feature to leverage. You might object that not every necessary task can feel deeply meaningful. Bills need paying, emails need answering, and routine maintenance needs doing, regardless of how connected they feel to your larger purpose. This is true, but misses a crucial distinction. Meaning isn't inherent in tasks themselves, but in how you perceive their connection to what matters. Through meaning infusion, even mundane activities can be transformed by connecting them to your core values and larger goals. Paying bills becomes an expression of responsibility and care for your future self. Answering emails becomes part of maintaining relationships and having impact. Routine maintenance becomes stewardship of resources that support your deeper purposes. This shift isn't about mental tricks or forced positivity. It's about recognizing genuine connections between necessary actions and what truly matters to you. When you clearly see how a task serves your values, resistance naturally diminishes. The meaning magnet begins pulling you forward instead of having to push yourself from behind. Through this lens, procrastination often signals a disconnection between your actions and your values, rather than a lack of discipline or time management skills. When you notice yourself consistently avoiding certain tasks, it's worth examining whether you've lost sight of their significance in your larger story. The power of this approach lies in its alignment with your mind's natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. Instead of trying to force yourself to be productive through sheer willpower, you can focus on strengthening the magnetic pull of meaning that makes action feel inevitable rather than optional. Take a moment to reflect on activities that naturally energize you, work that feels more like being pulled forward than pushed from behind. What values do these activities connect to? What larger purpose do they serve? Understanding your personal meaning patterns reveals clues about how to infuse more significance into tasks that currently feel disconnected and resistance-prone. This meaning-centered approach addresses multiple forms of procrastination simultaneously because it changes your fundamental relationship with action. Rather than battling resistance, you cultivate natural momentum by aligning tasks with what matters most to you. Willpower becomes less necessary because meaning itself generates the energy for action. When your work flows from genuine purpose, even previously daunting tasks transform into expressions of your deepest values. The resistance that once seemed like an immovable wall reveals itself as merely a temporary shadow, dissolving in the light of authentic motivation. As you tap into this deeper current of meaning, you'll find yourself naturally drawn toward action, rather than having to push yourself forward through brute force. Chapter 15. The Identity Shift. Your relationship with procrastination runs deeper than your to-do list or time management system. It extends into the very foundations of how you see yourself. There's a profound difference between viewing procrastination as something you occasionally do versus accepting it as an intrinsic part of who you are. This distinction shapes every decision you make about taking action. When you identify as a procrastinator, you unconsciously create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Each delayed task, each postponed project becomes not just an isolated incident, but further evidence supporting your core identity. This creates a cycle where your actions continuously reinforce your self-image, which in turn guides your future actions. Identity acts as the soil from which your behaviors naturally grow. Just as a seed can only produce what's encoded in its DNA, your actions tend to align with your deepest beliefs about who you are. When you try to force behaviors that conflict with your identity, you experience internal resistance that makes sustained change nearly impossible. This explains why traditional approaches to overcoming procrastination often fall short. They focus on modifying surface-level behaviors without addressing the deeper identity patterns that generate those behaviors. It's like trying to change the fruit without examining the roots. Possible in the short term, but unsustainable over time. Your brain constantly works to maintain consistency between your actions and your self-image. When you see yourself as someone who takes immediate action, procrastination creates cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental state your mind works to resolve by adjusting your behavior to match your identity. Conversely, when you view yourself as a procrastinator, taking prompt action feels somehow false or inauthentic. This dynamic reveals why willpower-based approaches to overcoming procrastination typically fail. When your actions conflict with your identity, you're fighting against your own psychological immune system. Your mind actively works to restore alignment between behavior and self-image, making sustained change through force of will extremely difficult. However, this same mechanism that can perpetuate procrastination also holds the key to its dissolution. When you shift your core identity, new behaviors emerge naturally without requiring constant effort or attention. The question transforms from, "How do I stop procrastinating?" to "Who am I becoming?" You might worry that focusing on identity change means rejecting who you truly are or forcing yourself into an inauthentic mold. But identity itself is more fluid and shapeable than commonly recognized. Rather than a fixed characteristic, your self-image is more like a story you tell about yourself, one that can be consciously revised and updated. This malleability of identity offers a powerful lever for changing your relationship with action. Instead of battling procrastination directly, you can focus on cultivating an identity that makes procrastination feel increasingly incongruent with who you are. This shift happens not through force, but through gradual, intentional evolution of your self-narrative. The transformation occurs at the level of language and self-dialogue. Notice the difference between "I'm trying not to procrastinate" and "I'm someone who takes immediate action." The first frames change as an ongoing struggle against your nature. The second establishes prompt action as a natural expression of who you are. Your identity shapes your actions through the subtle but powerful mechanism of consistency. Your brain automatically moves toward behaviors that confirm your self-image and away from those that contradict it. By consciously evolving your identity, you create an internal environment where procrastination becomes increasingly uncomfortable, while immediate action feels increasingly natural. This identity-based approach addresses procrastination at its root, rather than just managing its symptoms. Instead of constantly pushing against resistance, you cultivate a self-image that generates natural momentum toward action. The effort shifts from forcing yourself to do what doesn't feel natural to becoming someone for whom prompt action is simply an expression of who you are. This perspective reveals why meaning and identity work together as the deepest drivers of behavior. When your actions align with both your values and your self-image, they acquire a sense of inevitability that makes procrastination increasingly unlikely. You move from "I should do this" to "This is who I am." The transformation runs deeper than simple habit formation. It fundamentally alters how you interpret the gap between intention and action. Tasks that once felt like obligations become natural expressions of your character, and the internal resistance that fueled procrastination dissolves into a quiet certainty about who you are and what matters to you. This alignment creates a powerful feedback loop where each action reinforces your identity, and your strengthened identity makes similar actions feel increasingly effortless. Chapter 16. The Flow Channel. The contrast between forced effort and effortless engagement reveals a fundamental truth about human motivation. When you find yourself grinding through tasks with sheer willpower, constantly checking the clock and feeling every minute drag by, you're experiencing what happens when action exists outside the natural flow state. Yet you've also experienced those magical moments when time seems to evaporate, when you're so absorbed in what you're doing that hours pass like minutes and action feels completely natural. This stark difference isn't about the inherent nature of the tasks themselves, but rather about finding the optimal challenge level that creates engagement. like a river that can either fight against you or carry you forward. Your relationship with any activity depends largely on whether you're working with or against your mind's natural tendencies. The concept of the flow channel illuminates why the same task can feel like an impossible burden one day and an engaging challenge the next. When an activity presents a challenge level that significantly exceeds your current capabilities, it triggers anxiety and resistance. Your mind naturally pulls back from what feels overwhelming. Conversely, when a task falls well below your skill level, boredom sets in, and procrastination becomes a way of seeking more engaging stimulation. The sweet spot lies in what psychologists call the flow channel, where challenge and capability align to create natural engagement. In this state, the activity demands enough attention to keep you focused, but remains achievable enough to maintain confidence. This balance creates an intrinsic reward system that makes continuation feel effortless. Understanding this dynamic transforms how you approach task resistance. Instead of seeing procrastination as a character flaw to overcome through force, you can recognize it as valuable feedback about the relationship between challenge and capability. When you consistently avoid certain activities, it often indicates they've fallen outside your flow channel, either overwhelming you with complexity or failing to engage your full capabilities. The key lies in calibration rather than coercion. By consciously adjusting task parameters to match your current state, you can often eliminate procrastination naturally. This might mean breaking down overwhelming projects into smaller, more manageable pieces when energy is low, or adding creative challenges to routine tasks when you need more engagement. Consider how elite athletes adjust their training intensity based on their current capacity. Some days calling for intense challenge, others for active recovery. The same principle applies to any type of work. The goal isn't to maintain maximum intensity at all times, but to find the level of engagement that creates sustainable forward momentum. Flow calibration becomes particularly powerful when you recognize the dynamic nature of your capacity. Your ability to engage with challenging tasks fluctuates based on energy levels, time of day, recent experiences, and countless other factors. Rather than fighting these natural variations, you can work with them by adjusting challenge levels accordingly. This perspective shift transforms procrastination from a battle of willpower into an opportunity for calibration. When you feel resistance to a task, rather than forcing yourself forward or giving in to delay, you can ask, how could this activity be adjusted to better match my current capabilities? Sometimes the answer involves breaking the task down into smaller steps. Other times it means adding interesting constraints or creative elements that increase engagement. The flow channel isn't about making every task perpetually enjoyable. Some activities will always require a degree of disciplined effort. However, by understanding and working with your mind's natural tendency toward optimal challenge levels, you can significantly reduce the friction that leads to procrastination. When challenge and capability align, procrastination often dissolves naturally. The task itself becomes magnetic, pulling you forward through intrinsic engagement rather than requiring constant push from external pressure or willpower. This creates a sustainable foundation for consistent action that doesn't depend on maintaining perpetual discipline or motivation. Your mind already knows the way out of procrastination. You've experienced this truth countless times without realizing its significance. In those precious moments when you found yourself completely absorbed in a task, time seems to lose its rigid grip. The world around you grows quiet, your inner critic falls silent, and action flows with an effortless grace that makes stopping feel harder than continuing. Perhaps it happened while cooking a complex meal, solving an intriguing problem, or engaging in deep conversation. The activity itself became magnetic, drawing you deeper into its unfolding possibilities. These experiences aren't anomalies or lucky accidents. They're glimpses of your natural state when challenge and capability align perfectly. They reveal the profound truth that your mind instinctively seeks engagement when conditions are right. External pressure, guilt, and force become unnecessary when you tap into this intrinsic pull toward meaningful action. By understanding and working with this innate tendency rather than against it, you unlock a different kind of motivation, one that propels you forward through genuine interest rather than manufactured discipline. Chapter 17: The Energy Equation. Every action you take requires energy, whether physical, mental, emotional, or creative. When you find yourself procrastinating, it's often not a failure of discipline, but a signal from your internal energy management system. Think about those times you've tried to force yourself to work when completely depleted, only to spend hours staring at a screen with nothing to show for it. Or those moments when you've pushed through exhaustion to complete a task, only to find yourself unable to focus for days afterward. This pattern reveals a crucial truth. Productivity isn't about maximizing output through constant effort. It's about understanding and working with your natural energy rhythms. Just as an ecosystem maintains balance through cycles of activity and restoration, your capacity for focused work depends on respecting your body's need for both expenditure and renewal. The energy equation fundamentally reshapes how you approach task management. Different activities consume or generate different types of energy. Creative work might drain your mental resources while energizing you emotionally. Administrative tasks might preserve your creative energy while depleting your attention reserves. Understanding these patterns transforms procrastination from a character flaw into a valuable signal about resource allocation. Modern productivity culture often treats human energy as an unlimited resource to be extracted through sufficient willpower. This approach mirrors unsustainable industrial practices that deplete natural resources without allowing for regeneration. Just as strip mining eventually renders land barren, forcing yourself to work without respecting energy limits leads to diminishing returns and potential burnout. Your cognitive resources follow specific depletion patterns. Decision-making, focused attention, and creative thinking draw from separate but interconnected energy pools. When you deplete one area, it affects your capacity in others. This explains why after hours of detailed analytical work, you might find yourself procrastinating on simple decisions or creative tasks. You've exhausted the relevant cognitive resources. The brain requires specific conditions for replenishment. Different forms of rest and engagement restore different types of energy. Light physical activity might refresh your capacity for focused attention. Social interaction could recharge your emotional energy. Unstructured thinking time often replenishes creative resources. Understanding these restoration patterns is as crucial as knowing how energy gets depleted. This isn't about avoiding demanding work or only acting when you feel energized. Rather, it's about strategic energy allocation, matching tasks to your natural rhythms, and ensuring proper restoration between periods of intense focus. Sometimes external demands require working when energy is low, but understanding your patterns helps you prepare for and recover from these necessary pushes. Energy mapping reveals your unique patterns of peak performance and natural renewal. When are you naturally alert and focused? Which activities drain you most quickly? What truly restores your energy versus what just feels like rest? These insights allow you to design workflows that align with rather than fight against your natural rhythms. The transformation comes from shifting from a resource extraction mindset to an ecosystem nurturing approach. Instead of forcing yourself to work through depletion, you learn to read your energy signals and respond appropriately. This might mean tackling your most demanding tasks during peak energy periods, scheduling restoration activities before resources are fully depleted, or adjusting task sequences to maintain sustainable momentum. Your energy signature is unique. What energizes one person might drain another. Some people have their peak mental clarity in the morning, others late at night. Certain tasks that deplete most people might actually energize you. Understanding your personal patterns is essential for sustainable productivity. This energy-aware approach integrates seamlessly with previous concepts like minimum viable actions and flow states. When you're depleted, you can use smaller action steps to maintain progress without overwhelming your reduced resources. Understanding your energy patterns helps you find the optimal times for entering flow states, when you have sufficient resources for full engagement. By mapping your natural rhythms, you discover windows of opportunity, where deep work feels effortless and resistance melts away. These insights transform how you structure your days. Instead of forcing productivity at random times, you align your most challenging work with your natural peaks, preserving your energy for what matters most. The beauty of this approach lies in its adaptability. Some days you'll ride waves of inspiration, while others might call for gentle, sustainable progress through micro-actions that honor your current capacity. Chapter 18. The Relapse Revolution. The moment of returning to old patterns arrives for everyone. You find yourself slipping back into procrastination after weeks or months of consistent action, and immediately the familiar voices of self-judgment begin their chorus. I knew this wouldn't last. I'm just not disciplined enough. Why can't I stay consistent? This reaction is so common, so deeply ingrained, that it often causes more damage than the temporary return to procrastination itself. What if these moments of apparent regression aren't failures at all? What if they're actually essential components of lasting transformation, carrying vital information about your growth process that can accelerate your development when properly understood? This perspective shift fundamentally changes how you experience and respond to inevitable moments of inconsistency. Think of transformation as a spiral staircase rather than a ladder. From certain angles, it might appear you're passing the same point repeatedly, but with each rotation, you're actually ascending to a higher level of understanding and integration. Each time you encounter familiar procrastination patterns, you're experiencing them from a more elevated perspective, equipped with deeper awareness and stronger tools for responding effectively. This isn't mere positive thinking. It's a fundamental truth about how human beings actually transform. The mind rarely changes in a straight line. It spirals upward through cycles of progress, integration, and temporary regression that ultimately lead to more sustainable growth. The expectation of linear progress, of perfect consistency from the moment you understand a concept, creates unnecessary suffering and often triggers the very patterns you're working to transform. The spiral nature of growth reveals itself in subtle ways. When you return to procrastination patterns, you'll notice you catch yourself sooner. The periods of delay grow shorter. The recovery process becomes smoother. Most importantly, your relationship with these moments begins to shift from one of harsh self-judgment to curious observation and strategic response. Research in habit formation consistently shows that expecting perfect consistency often backfires, creating rigid, unsustainable approaches that collapse under their own pressure. The most successful transformations emerge through flexible persistence, maintaining direction while allowing for natural fluctuations in implementation. This isn't about making excuses or lowering standards. It's about aligning your growth strategy with how human beings actually develop and change. Your response to perceived setbacks shapes their impact far more than the setbacks themselves. When you interpret returns to procrastination as complete failures, you trigger shame and discouragement that make recovery more difficult. When you view these moments as natural parts of your growth spiral, you maintain the psychological safety necessary for continuous development. This revolutionary approach to relapse transforms these moments from sources of shame into opportunities for deeper integration. Each return to old patterns becomes a chance to understand your triggers more clearly, to refine your strategies more precisely, and to strengthen your commitment more authentically. The question shifts from, "Why do I keep failing?" to, "What can I learn from this that will inform my next rotation up the spiral?" The practical implications of this perspective are profound. Instead of attempting to eliminate relapses entirely, an approach that usually creates more pressure and paradoxically increases their likelihood, you develop specific protocols for responding when they occur. These responses transform setbacks from momentum killers into launching pads for stronger action patterns. Instead of viewing consistency as an all-or-nothing proposition, you begin to see it as an evolving integration of new patterns. Each spiral upward builds upon previous experiences, incorporating lessons learned from both successes and temporary regressions. This cumulative growth process creates more sustainable transformation than any attempt at perfect linear progress. Your relationship with procrastination setbacks reveals deep patterns in how you handle growth and change in all areas of life. Do you tend toward harsh self-judgment or complete abandonment of your goals? Do you use temporary regression as an excuse to give up entirely? Or can you maintain direction while allowing for natural fluctuations in your implementation? Understanding these patterns allows you to develop more effective responses that maintain momentum despite imperfect progress. The true revolution comes in realizing that transformation isn't about achieving perfect consistency. It's about changing your relationship with inconsistency itself. When you no longer fear temporary returns to procrastination, you create the psychological safety necessary to implement all the principles we've explored throughout this book without the paralysis of perfectionism. Conclusion. Throughout this journey, you've discovered that procrastination isn't the enemy you've been fighting. It's a perception that dissolves when viewed through a different lens. What began as a battle against delay has transformed into an understanding of how your mind naturally engages with action, revealing that the struggle itself often creates the very resistance you're trying to overcome. You've explored how resistance amplifies when confronted directly, yet dissipates when approached with curiosity and acceptance. You've seen how motivation doesn't precede action but emerges from it, reversing the conventional wisdom that keeps many trapped waiting for the perfect moment to begin. The perceived difficulty of starting has been revealed as largely illusory, a mirage that disappears when you step toward it rather than standing back in anticipation. Through the power of minimum viable actions, you've discovered how tiny steps collapse the seemingly insurmountable distance between intention and action. You've experienced how momentum, once generated, carries you forward with an ease that makes previous resistance seem almost incomprehensible. By eliminating unnecessary decisions through pre-commitment, you've freed yourself from the cognitive burden that depletes willpower and enables procrastination. Your environment has emerged as a powerful ally in this transformation, showing how strategic design can make action inevitable rather than optional. You've uncovered how meaning serves as a natural magnet for engagement, pulling you forward when connected to values and purpose. Perhaps most profoundly, you've seen how identity shapes behavior more powerfully than any technique. How becoming someone who takes immediate action transforms procrastination from a constant struggle to an occasional visitor. These insights aren't separate strategies to be implemented one by one, but interconnected facets of a single perceptual shift. When you see the gap between intention and action as crossable in an instant rather than requiring monumental effort, everything changes. Your relationship with beginning transforms from dread to ease, from resistance to flow. This transformation isn't a destination but an ongoing evolution. Old patterns may occasionally resurface, but these moments aren't failures. They're opportunities for deeper integration of these truths. The spiral of growth you're on means passing familiar points from new heights, each turn bringing greater understanding and easier implementation. You already know this is possible because you've experienced it countless times throughout your life. Moments when action felt natural, when beginning happened without internal debate or struggle. These weren't anomalies, but glimpses of your natural state, one you can access more consistently now that you understand what creates and dissolves the illusion of procrastination. The freedom you've been seeking isn't found in constant vigilance or endless techniques, but in this fundamental shift in perception that transforms your relationship with action itself. When you see differently, you act differently, without force, without struggle, and without the weight of procrastination standing between you and the life you want to create. Thank you for listening and for investing in yourself. I believe in you. Your potential is endless. Now go out there and create the life you deserve. Create the life you deserve.